Hello and welcome to another video review. This is Neon Chrome for PC. This is a top-down twin-stick style shooter developed by 10 Tons Limited and actually released in its entirety yesterday as I'm uploading this video. As I'm uploading the video, of course, it is the 29th of April. You may have seen my video on the beta of this as of March 31st that I released earlier this month. And if you have, then you have a general idea of what this game is about, but you also know that the developers actually sent me a copy of this to take a look at, so thank you to them for that. But now the full game is actually out, so let's go ahead and take a look at this thing and find out how it is and whether it's worth the price of admission. Now, as far as presentation goes, this thing definitely relies more on aesthetic than actual visual quality, and that's actually perfectly fine. 10 Tons is a fairly small indie studio, so it stands to reason they wouldn't put out something that's super high fidelity. And what they're going for here is actually cyberpunk styling, which means that there's a lot of neon lights, there's a lot of office complex kind of stuff. It actually looks very, very cyberpunk when you get down to it. And while the modeling is definitely rather blocky and undetailed and the animations are a bit janky in spots, what really counts here are the particle effects. It actually looks pretty impressive when you've got all these projectiles flying all over the place, giblets flying everywhere, lots of explosions, the walls crumbling around you and things like that. It actually ends up lending a lot of charm to the visuals, and it really does give you some nice visual feedback on the absolute devastation that you can be causing. And because of all this, you actually get the added bonus of feeling like you actually just tore the place up when you go back through the level trying to find something you might have missed. And there's corpses everywhere, there's body parts all over the place, walls have crumbled, the various bits of scenery are just smashed to bits. You feel pretty satisfied at that, actually. So basically what the game lacks in visual fidelity, it actually makes up for in terms of the aesthetic and how it actually applies to game feel. The sound design, on the other hand, is a bit more mixed. It has music which is very fitting for the cyberpunk theme. It's a lot of electronic stuff that is actually pretty catchy, so they did a very good job with that. But when you get to the sound effects and the voice acting, the voice work comes across as robotic, which is what they're going for, but it does also come across a bit cheesy at times, and not really in a good way. It's certainly not enough to become much more than a mild annoyance, if it does even bother you at all, though. And then there's the sound effects, which range from actually fairly beefy to not quite as beefy and needing more bass. Luckily, none of them are completely wimpy, so there's at least that. It's not like a lot of modern games where they have weapons that should sound pretty powerful but end up sounding incredibly pathetic. But the sounds are still a bit disappointingly tame. But of course, it's possible to forgive the presentation having issues so long as the story and the gameplay are up to snuff. The story is actually pretty simplistic, and it's not really much more than a justification for why you're doing the things you're doing in the game. You play as an anonymous character who is basically mind-controlling a bunch of what are known as assets. They're basically just these various characters that have really no background and no personality of their own. They're just avatars for you to mess around with. And each of them have their own specific sets of abilities. To give you an example, hackers can get into containers that nobody else can. Assassins cloak when they're not in bright light. The soldier has a shield that reduces incoming damage from the front, and so on and so forth. But like I said, they're avatars. They're not really characters that you can think of. The only thing that does differentiate them is those special abilities. And you are using these assets to go up against the Overseer, who has basically lost his mind according to pretty much everybody who isn't him. And the basic crux of the story is that you're just trying to take down the Overseer to stop him from controlling everything and basically making everything a dystopia. Like I said, it's used as little more than a justification for the things that you're doing in this game, which is basically shooting a lot of things. I mean, let's face it, this is a twin-stick shooter. You don't really expect much in the way of plot out of those. You expect it to give you a story primer and then let you loose to wreak havoc upon your foes, and that is exactly what you do in Neon Chrome. You run through the levels, you blast the living crap out of everything in your path, and you move to the next level, repeat the process until you get to a boss fight, which has you basically memorizing patterns and gradually whittling down their health meter until they get to stage 2 and stage 3 of of their fight, in which case things get more and more difficult as you go along. To give you a prime example, the second boss you fight is the Centipede, and it starts off just kind of moving around slowly, and it has shielding on its various body parts, but it's regularly throwing out these things that I like to refer to as eyeballs, because that's what they basically look like, and they fly at you and explode. Well, you obviously had to whittle them down until you start taking out the actual body segments. Once you do that and you get it to stage 2 of the fight, where their health meter is down to basically the second stage, then they start speeding around the map and laying mines all over the place, and they start spitting out these drones that actually shoot at you instead of simply flying at you to explode. And thus the boss fight gets a lot harder. And this is how every boss fight in the game goes. It has basically 3 stages, they get harder and harder as you go through, and the game itself is no pushover to begin with. It's actually kind of punishingly difficult. There's barely any health pickups in the game at all, and when you do get them, they barely even do anything to your health meter. And the healing stations that give you more health than those health pickups seem to give you a somewhat random amount of health. It doesn't ever seem to actually have any rhyme or reason to it. Sometimes it can refill most of your health meter, sometimes it can refill only about half of it, and these health stations are so few and far between that they actually can be very, very irritating if you're like me and you're really not very good at twin-stick shooters. Now, the way they try to compensate for this is by giving you various upgrades that you can find throughout the game. There's obviously these simple stat upgrades like, say, energy or damage or luck or something like that, where you spend credits that you just find throughout the game, they're the in-game currency, in order to upgrade your various abilities and thus get better and better over time, regardless of how terrible you are at the game. You get stat increases that eventually will just push you into territory where you should be able to handle the situation. Along the way, you will also expand your arsenal as you just continually loot things and just find weapons scattered all over the place. Things like lasers, railguns, whatever it may well be that you run across. And these can also be upgraded over time, although those are just basic stat increases like upgrading the rate of fire or upgrading the amount of damage that each individual projectile does, things like that. You will also find various stations that allow you to slot these cybernetic mods that will also give you some specific bonuses, such as giving you the ability to shock enemies around you, or perhaps they'll simply give you credit increases, so you just get a flat sum of credits, or you get a sum of credits when you complete a level. Or you might get further stat increases like increasing your melee damage or your movement speed or your reload speed. And every time you go to one of these stations, you're going to get a choice of several of these various mods that you can install, but you can only install one per station, and you have a limited number of slots to put them in. The number of slots you get is actually one of the things you can increase by simply buying them with credits. And while the specific cybernetic mods that are installed are going to change between the various characters and are going to be reset upon death, what you will find is that the actual stat increases and the number of slots and all these other things that you're upgrading over time will actually carry over into new characters. So there is definitely a sense of progression there, and you do feel like you are getting a bit more powerful as you continue grinding through the game. But notice my word choice there, grinding through the game, because at times it really does feel like you're just grinding to get better stat increases so you can actually go through the various parts that you're trying to get through. Obviously, the better you are at twin-stick shooters, the less problems you'll have in this particular regard, but if you're like me, and again, you're really not very good at this particular genre, then you're going to just find yourself dying over and over and over again at certain parts of the game until finally you manage to get all of your stat increases high enough to be able to basically eke out a victory there. That, or you just happen to get really lucky on a particular run, because the game does actually randomly generate a lot of the levels, and so you may just end up with some really poor luck of the draw and end up in a level with a lot of guys with shields or something like that, where basically the only effective tactics are either to use your special weapon, which has a very, very limited ammo capacity, because it uses your energy meter, which is very, very slow to charge, or the game will just decide to throw a whole platoon at you, and thus you end up getting annihilated incredibly quickly, or you'll just be in the wrong place at the wrong time when something explodes. Regardless, luck does play a fairly significant role in this. But that's really more in how the levels are actually set up. When you actually get into the proper gameplay, it's really more about your actual skills at being able to move around, dodge attacks, actually get some good shots in, destroy the right part of the environment at the right time, because that is actually a big thing in this game, being able to destroy the environment, or ducking behind the environment to avoid those precious few shots while you reload. Any number of these various tactics and skills that you'll need to use in order to actually be able to be successful at this game. And that's where the twin-stick shooter fans are going to be able to get a lot out of this game. If you're into that genre, then you are definitely going to find a very solid twin-stick shooter experience here, although you will definitely need to get used to the roguelite elements that they've tossed in there as well. But if you're like me and you're either a relatively casual fan of twin-stick shooters or you're just really not that into the genre, you only occasionally play them, then you're probably going to find that this is still a well-made twin-stick shooter. It's just that it kind of kicks your ass all the time, and I get the feeling that's what they were going for. The problem with that is that it significantly limits the audience that is going to be into this sort of game. It does have co-op, so it can draw in some of the co-op crowd as well, but unless you're really a big fan of twin-stick shooters, it's going to be a lot harder for you to be able to get into this thing. And thus, it's actually really hard to recommend to anyone but twin-stick shooter fans, because they're going to get the most out of it, and the rest of us are just going to be like, it's alright, I guess. In fact, the more I played it, the more I got frustrated with it, and I ended up just basically limiting it to very short play sessions. Maybe I'd do one run, or maybe at the most 2 runs before I decide, you know what, I need a break from this. And I can see that working out a lot better, because this game doesn't really feel like it's meant for long play sessions. It feels like it's meant more for a quick run or two, then taking a break and coming back to it later when you've got a bit of time to kill. Especially considering you can't really save the game, and so it only kind of auto-saves every time you complete a segment of levels. So whenever you beat a boss is basically when you move on to the next area, and that will unlock a new fast travel point. Of course, every single time you start at those, you start fresh with a brand new character who has none of the upgrades that you might have had from previous levels, so that can be kind of a problem, but I guess that's where the progression system comes in. And ultimately, that's the thing. If you like twin-stick shooters and you like roguelite elements, then you're going to probably absolutely love this game. If you don't like either of those things, then you won't like this game. It's really that simple. It's all going to come down to your personal preferences, and whether or not you are willing to put up with the RNG in this thing in order to be able to really get at that actually pretty fun core. It's just that that core tends to get rather frustrating if you're on the end of the spectrum that isn't very good at these kinds of games. But ultimately, I'm giving this a conditional 3.5. If you're really into the genre, then you'll be able to get a hell of a lot more out of it. But if you're more of a layperson, then it's still a good game, don't get me wrong, but you just won't be able to get anywhere near as much out of it as a hardcore twin-stick shooter fan is going to be able to. And for them, it's probably going to be closer to a 4 or maybe even a 4.5. I'm not entirely sure, because I'm not one of those kinds of people. But 10 Tons definitely knows what they're doing with these kind of twin-stick shooters, and it really does show here with a very, very high-quality game. It's just that you kind of have to be in the right mindset to get the most out of it. Thanks for watching.